The signal arrived at 3:47 hours, Earth Standard Time, and it did not knock. It broadcast simultaneously across every human communication frequency, military, civilian, emergency, deep space relay, in a voice that carried the particular smoothness of something that had never been told no. The translation AIs aboard ISS Concord processed the language in 0.3 seconds. Ambassador Cira Valdez was woken from sleep, handed a tablet, and given 30 seconds to read before her comms officer told her the signal was already being picked up on Earth. She read it twice. The Galactic Council, a governing body of 23 spacefaring species spanning 40 star systems, had formally assessed humanity as a Class 3 tributary species. The designation carried specific obligations: 40% of annual resource extraction, a standing labor quota of 12 million workers per cycle, full subordination of military assets under Council command, and the immediate surrender of all faster-than-light research to Council oversight. Compliance was expected within 90 standard cycles, roughly 8 Earth months. There was no or else. The Council didn't use that language. They didn't need to. 11 species had received this message before humanity. All 11 had complied within the first 30 cycles. Valdez set the tablet down on her bunk and sat very still for a moment. She was 44 years old, born in Cartagena, Colombia, the daughter of a marine biologist and a retired Army colonel. She had spent 6 years negotiating trade rights in the outer colonies, had brokered the Titan Accord, had once talked a separatist faction on Mars down from open rebellion through 47 consecutive hours of dialogue. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But she felt something cold move through her chest as she read the message a third time. Not fear exactly, recognition. She had read enough history to know what this was. The language was different, formal, bureaucratic, almost polite, but the structure was ancient. It was the same message that empires had always sent to the peoples they intended to consume. You are smaller than us. You are weaker than us. You will give us what we want, and in exchange, we will allow you to continue existing. The Romans had sent it. The Mongols had sent it. The British Empire had refined it into an art form. And now something from 40 light years away was sending it to the entire human race. Valdez got dressed, walked to the bridge, and opened a channel to the UN Emergency Assembly, which had already convened in emergency session. She watched the feeds from Earth. The debates were ferocious, immediate, and real. Some argued for compliance. These were not cowards. They were people who had run the numbers, who understood that humanity's combined fleet was a fraction of the Council's military strength, who had done the math on what a full military engagement would cost in human lives. They spoke with pale faces and steady voices, and made their case clearly. Others argued differently. An elderly general from the Indian Army, Admiral Priya Nair, stood before the assembly with her hands flat on the table and said 7 words that ended the debate. If we yield now, we yield forever. The vote was not close. Valdez spent the next 14 hours drafting humanity's response with a team of linguists, historians, military advisors, and one surprisingly useful moral philosopher from Oslo. They stripped every word of ambiguity. They left no room for misinterpretation. They made it elegant because Valdez believed that even defiance deserved craft. The final transmission was 847 words long, a formal diplomatic response, structured in the Council's own legal framework, citing 11 points of galactic common law that the Council itself had written, arguing that the tributary designation had been applied without proper species assessment, without consent, and without legal standing. And at the very end, after all the careful legal architecture, after all the measured diplomatic language, came the answer that Cira Valdez had known was inevitable from the moment she first read the summons in her bunk. On behalf of the unified Earth government and all sovereign human peoples across the Sol system and its colonies, we reject the tributary designation in its entirety. We will not remit resources. We will not surrender our people. We will not yield our research. We will not subordinate our military, now or ever, under any circumstance, at any cost. We will never yield. She transmitted it on every frequency. Then she poured herself a coffee, sat back in her chair, and waited for the galaxy to respond. It didn't take long. High Arbiter Voskareth had ruled the Galactic Council for 62 standard years, which was long enough to have seen empires collapse, species go extinct, and suns die. He was not easily surprised. He was also not by nature a laughing creature. His species, the Veldari, communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns along their collar fronds, and amusement registered as a slow amber pulse. When humanity's response arrived, his fronds lit amber from root to tip. He read the transmission aloud to his senior counsel in the great chamber of Vetholer, his voice carrying the particular tone of a being sharing a joke that only he fully appreciated. Around the curved amphitheater, representatives of 22 other species watched and listened. Several laughed alongside him. Several did not. Senior Advisor Keth Muron, a Davari, gray-skinned, four-armed, and approximately 300 years old, did not laugh. She had the longest institutional memory on the council. She remembered the Korathi who had also refused. That had been 900 years ago, and the Korathi were gone now, absorbed and dissolved across a dozen tributary systems, their language surviving only in academic archives. She had voted for leniency then, too, and been overruled then, too. She pulled up humanity's 900-page military history dossier on her personal screen and began reading. She was on page 47, the Second World War, when the amber light from Voskareth's fronds began to feel less funny to her. Page 93, the Korean War, the phrase frozen Chosin. The frostbitten soldiers who carried their dead rather than leave them made something shift uncomfortably in her chest. By page 212, the account of the siege of Stalingrad, she had stopped skimming and was reading every word. She flagged the document for the full council's mandatory review and was told politely that the High Arbiter had already closed the matter. The Dominion Armada, the council's primary enforcement fleet, was being assembled. It was not a small force, 1,200 warships, 3 full carrier groups, 7 siege platforms capable of reducing a planet's surface to glass from orbit. It had pacified the Gorathi rebellion. It had ended the Velsari secession in 11 days. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most powerful military instruments in the known galaxy. Its commanding admiral, Fleet Lord Davin Shear, was given a simple brief. Approach the Sol system, demonstrate force, accept humanity's capitulation, and return within 40 cycles. He was not told to be careful. No one had ever needed to be told to be careful with a Class 3 species. Shear reviewed what intelligence the Council had on human military capability. It was thin. Humanity had only possessed FTL travel for 30 years, and had spent most of that time exploring rather than militarizing. Their navy consisted of approximately 400 vessels, mostly retrofitted civilian ships and a small core of purpose-built warships. Their weapons technology was assessed as functional but primitive. Their tactical doctrine was unclassified, insufficient engagements for analysis. That last line would later be cited in the official inquiry as the first critical error. Back on Earth, the mood was not what outsiders might have expected. There was fear, real, widespread, bone-deep fear. Families had seen the size of the Armada on intercepted council transmissions. Protests broke out in 17 cities, not against the government's decision to refuse, but out of genuine terror at what was coming. People held their children a little tighter. They looked up at the sky differently. But something else was also happening. In shipyards on 4 continents and 2 orbital stations, work shifts went from 8 hours to 16. Engineers who had been working on civilian deep space transports quietly redirected their expertise. Mining operations in the asteroid belt, vast, sprawling industrial networks that had been extracting rare metals for decades, began receiving unusual modification orders. Automated systems, remote triggers, targeting arrays disguised as sensor equipment. Admiral Chen Mingjai, commander of Earth's unified defense fleet, did not give speeches. She did not make promises. She gathered her senior staff in a room on lunar base Artemis, spread a star chart of the Sol system across the table, and said 4 words. They don't know us. She tapped the asteroid belt, 2.2 astronomical units of rock, metal, ice, and human infrastructure stretching in a vast band between Mars and Jupiter. Humanity had been mining it for 20 years. They knew every gravitational eddy, every navigational corridor, every shadow. They'll come through here, she said, because it's the shortest route, because their maps say it's open space. She paused. Let's make sure it isn't. Planning began immediately. 90 cycles. They had 90 cycles. They used every single one. Fleet Lord Davin Shear brought his armada into the Sol system at the outer boundary of the heliopause. 1,200 ships dropping from FTL in a formation that had been specifically designed to be awe-inspiring. The emergence burst alone, the visual shockwave of 1,200 vessels simultaneously breaking faster than light travel, was visible to the naked eye from Earth's surface. People gathered on rooftops and watched it like a terrible sunrise. Shear opened a hailing channel immediately. He offered humanity one final opportunity to comply. His tone was almost gentle. The way a surgeon's voice is gentle when they tell you that the procedure will be necessary. Ambassador Valdez received the transmission aboard ISS Concord, still holding her position at the edge of Earth's orbital defense perimeter. She had been waiting for it. She replied with 2 words, "Proceed, Admiral." She meant proceed with whatever you're going to do. She was not speaking to Shear. She was speaking to Chen Mingjai. The Armada advanced. Shear had chosen the most direct route through the asteroid belt as Chen had predicted. His navigators were good. They had Council standard charts of the belt, updated within the last decade, showing the positions of human mining installations and the major navigational corridors. The charts were accurate. What they couldn't show, was what humanity had done to those corridors in the past 90 cycles. The mining rigs had been converted. Not visibly. From the outside, they looked exactly as they had on the charts. But inside, the ore processing systems had been gutted and replaced with electromagnetic rail drivers capable of accelerating a 2-ton tungsten slug to 0.04% the speed of light. Not impressive by warship standards. Devastating when fired from 800 platforms simultaneously against ships that believed themselves to be traveling through civilian infrastructure. The drone swarms were the other thing. Humanity had been building autonomous mining drones for 15 years, small, fast, cheap, and precise. In the months since the summons, 12,000 of them had been quietly reprogrammed. They sat dormant inside asteroids, in the shadows of rock formations that didn't appear on any council chart because humanity had discovered them after the charts were made. They ran no active signals. They were, to every scanner the Armada possessed, simply rock. Shear's fleet entered the belt in standard formation. Lead elements first, destroyers and screening vessels, followed by the capital ships. The first salvo came without warning. 600 rail slugs crossed the belt in under a second, fired from emplacements on both sides of the corridor simultaneously. 17 Council destroyers ceased to exist. Not damaged, ceased to exist, their hulls shredded by impacts moving at velocities their armor had never been rated against. The Armada's point defense systems, the best in the galaxy, began responding immediately, but they had been designed to intercept missiles, which announced themselves. They had no profile for tungsten rods, moving at 4% light speed in a gravity field. Then the drones activated. 12,000 of them, boiling out of the rock simultaneously, not attacking, guiding. They swarmed the Armada's scanner arrays, physically attaching to hull surfaces, broadcasting false signals, creating ghost readings. Council warship commanders suddenly found their tactical displays showing contacts that didn't exist and missing contacts that did. Friendly fire became a problem within 11 minutes. 2 Council capital ships destroyed a third before the battle AI systems overrode their weapons. Shear was not a fool. He recognized the trap and began ordering a fighting withdrawal. It was the right call, executed well. But the belt was long, and humanity's emplacements were on both sides, and Chen had positioned 3 squadrons of human warships at the exit point, not to win a direct engagement, but to delay. To keep the Armada in the killing ground 20 minutes longer than it wanted to be. When the Dominion fleet finally broke clear of the belt and accelerated toward open space, it had lost 31 capital ships and 64 smaller vessels. 14 more were damaged beyond combat effectiveness. The Armada had destroyed 9 human vessels in return. Shear filed his retreat order. It was the first retreat order the Dominion Armada had filed in 60 years. Back in the Great Chamber of Vetholer, the amber light from Voskareth's fronds had gone very, very dark. And across 11 tributary systems, 11 species that had always complied, that had never imagined another choice was possible, were watching the battle footage on repeat. The Council's emergency session lasted 9 hours, which was 7 hours longer than any session in the past century. Voskareth sat at the head of the chamber and listened to his advisors speak, and for the first time in 62 years of rule, he found the voices around him genuinely divided. The military faction wanted immediate escalation, overwhelming force, 3 full armadas, siege platforms, no engagement in the belt, direct orbital bombardment, reduce Earth to silence and make it visible to every species in the galaxy. The message had to be clear. Defiance had a cost that no civilization could absorb. Senior advisor Keth Muron spoke against it for 40 minutes calmly, with data. She had finished the human history dossier by this point, all 900 pages. She had cross-referenced it with the psychological profiles their sociologists had assembled and with the economic impact models from the Council's own treasury. She presented her conclusion without drama. Orbital bombardment will not break them. I want to be precise about this. It is not an opinion. It is a projection based on their documented response to civilizational trauma. This species has experienced extinction-level events, global wars, plagues, and economic collapses. Their response, consistently and without exception across recorded history, is to continue. In many documented cases, destruction accelerates their mobilization rather than diminishing it. If we bomb their cities, we will not receive surrender. We will receive a species in total war footing with nothing left to lose. Voskareth listened, then he overruled her. He authorized a second campaign, larger, this time targeting colonies rather than the military fleet, outer settlements, resource installations, the soft civilian infrastructure that any species would struggle to watch burn. He believed it. He was not a monster. He was something more dangerous, a ruler who had never been wrong before and who had therefore never learned to imagine being wrong. The Second Armada assembled within 40 cycles, twice the size of the first. This one would not enter the asteroid belt. It would approach from the ecliptic south, bypassing the human kill zone and strike 3 outer colonies with enough force to make every human on Earth understand what continued defiance would cost. What Voskareth did not know, because his intelligence apparatus had focused entirely on Earth's military, was what had been happening in the past weeks across 11 other star systems. The Torvani had stopped their tribute shipments first. They were a quiet species, avian, deeply communal, not given to displays of aggression. They had been tributary for 60 years and had never once missed a shipment. 3 days after the asteroid belt footage circulated on open channels, their council liaison received a formal communication. The Torvani Collective was reassessing its arrangement pending review of council military conduct. The language was careful. The meaning was not. The Gorathi followed within a week. Then the Selvari. Then 4 more species in 1s and 2s, all carefully worded, all citing procedural concerns or treaty review processes, all unmistakably watching a small blue planet hold its ground and asking themselves the same question. If they can do it, what does that mean for us? Voskareth branded humanity a contagion of defiance in a closed session. The phrase leaked. It was repeated on 30 worlds within 72 hours. On most of them, it was not heard as a warning. It was heard as a description, and several species found, to their quiet surprise, that it did not sound like a bad thing to be. Part 5, Fire from the Sky, and what came after. The Second Armada struck at 200 hours local time on Kepler Colony 7. The colony had 340,000 people. It was humanity's oldest established outer settlement, 40 years old, built into the side of a mountain range on a world with thin atmosphere and brutal winters. The people who lived there were the children and grandchildren of the original settlers, people who had spent their entire lives solving problems that shouldn't have been solvable, who had carved a functioning civilization out of a planet that had actively tried to kill their parents. The Armada did not attempt to engage the colony's modest defense installation. They struck from range, 3 siege platforms, 1 hour of bombardment. The central dome complex was destroyed in the first 4 minutes. The agricultural networks took another 20. The power grid went in the 3rd hour. Then the Armada moved on to Colony 4 and Colony 11. The footage that reached Earth was not the footage the Council expected it to be. Yes, there was destruction. Yes, there was loss. The final count across 3 colonies was 27,000 dead, the worst single-event casualty figure in human history since the 21st century. The grief was real and enormous and heavy. Valdez watched the casualty reports come in from ISS Concord and sat in silence for a long time. But the footage that began circulating on open channels, the footage that reached 30 species across 40 systems, was not the burning ruins. It was what came after. It was the engineers in vacuum suits, working in live radiation zones to restore the power grid, 12 hours after bombardment. It was the search and rescue teams who had been drilling for exactly this scenario, and who located survivors in collapsed sections 70 hours after impact. It was the colony governor, a woman named Adiz Okonkwo, 61 years old, 1 arm broken, broadcasting from a makeshift command post, who gave a 16-minute address to her remaining colonists that was calm, specific, practical, and ended with the words, "We have rebuilt before. We will rebuild again. Get to work." And then they did. Children were evacuated to orbital shelters. Everyone else stayed. Medical teams arrived from Earth within 70 hours. Supply ships followed. Within 3 weeks, the power grid on Colony 7 was partially restored. Within 6 weeks, the first new agricultural dome was operational. The Council had expected images of a species on its knees. What the galaxy saw instead were people in radiation suits laying new conduit by hand in the ruins of a dome, in silence, without ceremony, because there was work to do. 12 species sent aid shipments. Unsigned, for the most part, no government wanted to formally antagonize the Council yet. But the ships came. Medical supplies, food, construction materials, power cells. They arrived with no flags and no fanfare. Someone had to have authorized them. No one admitted to it. On Earth, military production had reached levels not seen since the darkest decades of the previous century. Not because the government ordered it, because the workers chose it. Voluntary extra shifts in shipyards. Engineers submitting unprompted design modifications. A retired weapons physicist in Sao Paulo who hadn't worked in 20 years filed a propulsion improvement that Chen's team immediately classified and implemented. Humanity had a particular quality that Kethmeron had tried to explain to the High Arbiter and that he had failed to grasp. They did not fight well because they were told to. They fought because, when pressed past a certain point, they became personally invested in not losing. It was less like a military calculation and more like something biological, something that had been bred into them across millions of years of difficult living on a difficult planet. Kethmeron watched the Colony 7 footage from her private office and wrote a memo to the High Arbiter. It was 3 paragraphs long. The last paragraph read, "We have not frightened them. We have unified them. I am formally requesting that we open diplomatic channels immediately." The memo was not answered. Admiral Chen Mingjai had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 6 weeks. She didn't look it, or rather, she had the particular quality of exhaustion that certain people carry so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from their normal state. Her staff were quietly, deeply afraid of her, not because she was unkind, she wasn't, but because her mind worked at a pace and depth that occasionally made her seem like a different category of organism. She stood at the central tactical table on lunar base Artemis and looked at the star chart she had been living inside for months. The Sol system. Every gravitational curve, every orbital mechanic, every shadow and corridor and ambush point. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. But her eyes were on something else now. They were on the supply lines. The Council Armada had to eat. It had to fuel. 1,200 warships required constant resupply, ammunition, reactor mass, biological consumables for 100,000 crew across 24 species. That supply came from a network of relay stations and depot worlds stretching back 40 light-years. And that network, Chen had noticed, had been built by an empire that had never fought a war on its own logistics chain. Because no one had ever made them. She had been quietly mapping those lines for 8 weeks, using data from 3 sources. Council communications intercepts, tactical information supplied anonymously from Torvani intelligence. The avian species was still officially neutral, but certain data packets had a distinctly feathered quality and old-fashioned calculation. An armada of that size, fuel consumption ratios, transit times, the gaps between resupply windows. She found 3 of them. 3 periods where the armada would be running lean before the next depot shipment. 3 windows where a strike on the right relay station would leave the forward fleet with meaningful supply pressure. She brought the plan to Valdez, who brought it to the UN Security Council, who approved it in a closed session that lasted 40 minutes. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening in the political sphere that Chen was tracking with equal attention. The Gorathi homeworld had officially notified the Council that it was suspending its military contribution to the Second Armada campaign, pending a formal review of the campaign's compliance with galactic humanitarian conventions. 3 Gorathi warships that had been assigned to the Armada quietly changed course. 2 Selvari admirals resigned their council commissions. Their formal letters cited irreconcilable conflicts with rules of engagement. They did not go home. Their current location was not public. And from a source so deeply embedded that Chen trusted only one other person with the intelligence, a council military advisor, species unknown, who had been quietly feeding Earth tactical information for 4 weeks, came word that Vos Garath's inner circle was fracturing. The military faction was still pushing for escalation. The diplomatic faction, led by Kethmeron, was now formally on record recommending negotiation. 2 other council members had begun private communications with Earth's diplomatic corps, through channels so indirect they were almost invisible. Almost. Valdez was a woman who noticed almost invisible things. She opened those channels carefully, without announcement, without recording, without official status. Just conversations, Quiet ones, she was very good at those. And in the ruins of Colony 7, Adiz Okonkwo stood in the new agricultural dome, smaller than the old one, but functional, with the first crop already seeded, and gave an interview to a journalist from Earth that circulated across 30 species news networks within 48 hours. She was asked if she feared a third attack. She looked at the journalist for a moment with an expression that was hard to categorize, not quite amusement, not quite contempt, something older and quieter than either. Fear of it, she said, or no fear of it, the crops still need water. The interview was translated into 19 languages. Several species had no direct cultural equivalent for her meaning. Their translation AIs flagged it as a paradox. Their historians told them it wasn't. The counteroffensive launched on a Tuesday. This was not an accident. Chen had a theory supported by limited but suggestive historical data that choosing a moment of absolute mundanity for a dramatic action had a psychological effect on the people executing it. It grounded them, kept the adrenaline from becoming noise. Tuesday, 900 hours. People arrived at their stations having had breakfast. Some had fed their children first. The plan was not a single strike. It was a sequence, 19 simultaneous operations across 4 theaters, each one timed to cascade into the next. Chen had spent months identifying which actions would produce which reactions from Council fleet commanders, and had built the offensive around those predicted responses, the way a chess player builds a combination around an opponent's best moves. The first thread was logistics. 3 human strike teams, fast, light, expendable by design ships crewed entirely by volunteers, hit the Council's primary fuel depot at Relay Station Veth 9. Not to destroy it, to delay it, to create a 72-hour gap in the resupply schedule that would leave the Second Armada's rear elements running on reduced fuel. The second thread was information, a coordinated burst of hacked Council communications, using a cipher exploit that the Torvani had quietly handed over, flooded the Armada's internal network with false fleet positioning data. Not convincingly false, just false enough to create 2 hours of verification delay at the worst possible moment. The third thread was political. Valdez transmitted a formal communication to 6 Council member species simultaneously, at a moment precisely calculated, using the intelligence from the anonymous Council advisor, when Voss Garath was in a session with his military faction and would not see it for 3 hours. The communication offered terms: immediate ceasefire, formal recognition of human sovereignty, and Earth's willingness to participate in an entirely restructured galactic governance arrangement based on mutual representation rather than tribute. It was addressed to the species who had already been privately talking to her. The fourth thread was Admiral Chen Mingjai and the main fleet. She came from 3 directions, not 4, because the fourth approach vector was where she wanted the Armada to think she was coming from, and had filled it with decoys. While the Council fleet's attention was on the false approach, Chen's main force hit the Armada's command structure directly, not trying to win a broadside engagement, but targeting communications arrays, sensor platforms, and the specific ships that housed fleet coordination AI. She had spent 8 weeks studying Council fleet architecture, and identified the 12 vessels without which the Armada's coordinated response capability dropped by 60%. She took 11 of them in the first 40 minutes. The Armada responded. It was not a broken force, and its individual ship commanders were skilled. But they were responding to a situation that changed every 20 minutes, with communications 30% degraded, fuel concerns in the rear elements, and an opponent who knew their system better than their own charts did. Coordination frayed. Responses came late. Ships that should have supported each other arrived in sequence instead of simultaneously. 3 Council member species formally withdrew from the campaign during the battle. Their ships turned and left. No drama, they simply stopped participating. 2 Selvari warships, the ones whose admirals had resigned their commissions, whose location had been unknown, appeared on Chen's tactical display, not attacking the Armada, but broadcasting on Council military frequencies. Their message, translated instantly by Earth's AIs, was a formal notification that they were exercising their right under galactic common law to withdraw military support from a campaign that had violated humanitarian conventions. They were not firing on anyone. They didn't need to. Their presence was the message. By 1900 hours, the Armada had lost another 40 vessels, with 60 more damaged. More critically, it had lost its operational coherence. Scheer, recalled and replaced after the first defeat, the new Fleet Lord, Admiral Corvendes, made the call that Scheer had made before him. Retreat, consolidate, Wait for orders. The Second Armada withdrew from the Sol system. In the great chamber of Vetholer, Voskareth sat very still for a long time after receiving the report. His fronds had gone completely dark, a color that, among the Veldari, indicated not anger but something closer to the moment before a decision. Kethmuran was already waiting outside the chamber. She had been waiting for 3 hours. She had a document in her hand. She had written it 8 weeks ago and had been waiting for the moment when he would be ready to read it. When the doors opened and his aide summoned her in, she walked to the head table and placed the document in front of him without speaking. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Diplomatic channels," he said. "Already open," she said. "Have been for 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been talking to 6 of our members. 8 now." He looked at the document again. Then he looked up at her and said, very quietly, "How did we misread them this badly?" Kethmuran considered her answer carefully. "We read their capability," she said, "and ignored their character." The negotiations took 4 months. They were held on neutral ground, a space station belonging to the Torvani Collective, which had formally offered its facilities and its mediators with a quiet satisfaction that bordered on pleasure. Ambassador Valdez led the human delegation. Kethmuran led the councils. Voskareth did not attend. He had 2 weeks before negotiations began resigned the High Arbitership, the first voluntary resignation in the office's 400-year history. His formal statement cited health. The Galactic political press cited 11 tributary species simultaneously suspending their arrangements and 6 council members filing formal motions of censure. The truth was probably somewhere in both. The negotiations were difficult. Not because of hostility, Kethmuran was a skilled and honorable counterpart, and Valdez trusted her within reasonable limits, but because they were genuinely complex. Restructuring a governance arrangement that spanned 40 star systems, involved 23 species, and had been operating for centuries was not a matter of a single agreement. It was a matter of building an architecture from scratch. Valdez did not approach it as a victor imposing terms. This was a choice that some of her own delegation questioned. Humanity had won militarily by most definitions. They could push harder. She declined. "We don't want an empire," she told her team during a recess in the 3rd week. "We want a galaxy we can actually live in. Those are different things. Act accordingly." The Sol Accord, as it was ultimately titled, ran to 400 pages. Its key provisions were these. The tributary system was formally abolished. All existing tributary arrangements were dissolved with immediate effect. In their place, a voluntary economic cooperation framework was established, with contribution rates negotiated bilaterally rather than imposed. A new governing body, the Council of Equals, replaced the old Galactic Council, with weighted representation based on population and a formal veto mechanism to prevent any single bloc from dominating decisions. Membership was voluntary. 17 species joined within the first month. Others were still watching. Earth received a founding seat. There was a signing ceremony, broadcast on every channel across 40 systems. Valdez signed for Earth with the same pen she had used to sign the Titan Accord a decade and a lifetime ago. Kethmuran signed for the Council's successor body with a stylus she had carried for 300 years. Afterward, a journalist asked Valdez how she felt. She thought about it genuinely, not performing modesty, not reaching for a quote. She thought about Adiz Okonkwo in the ruins of Colony 7. She thought about Admiral Chen, who had already gone back to work on the next problem. She thought about the 27,000 people who had not lived to see this day, and about the 14 billion who had. "Tired," she said, "and glad." The journalist waited, clearly expecting more. Valdez picked up her bag. "That's all," she said, and walked out. In the chambers of what had been the Great Chamber of Vetholer, now repurposed as the Hall of the Council of Equals, the final formality of the session was the reading of the founding statement into the Galactic record. Every member species had contributed a passage. Earth's passage was short. Valdez had insisted on brevity, over the objections of 3 committee members who felt the moment deserved grandeur. It read, "Humanity has no interest in dominion over others. We do not seek empire, and we will not build one. We have come to this table not as conquerors, but as neighbors, difficult ones, perhaps, stubborn ones, certainly, and we intend to remain at it. We ask only what we have always asked, to be met as equals. We have demonstrated at some cost to all parties that we will accept nothing less. We will never yield." but we are genuinely very happy to cooperate. The chamber was quiet for a moment after the reading. Then, slowly in ones and twos, then in groups, across every seat in the hall, it filled with sound. Not applause, exactly. Each species had its own expression of approval, its own noise, its own gesture. It built over 20 seconds into something that had no single word in any language, but that everyone in the room understood. Kethmuran, 300 years old and not given to displays, found that her hands were shaking slightly. She looked at them with an expression of mild surprise, then folded them in her lap and looked up at the hall and let herself feel what she was feeling. She thought, we almost lost something here. Something we didn't know the galaxy needed until a small, stubborn, impossible species refused to let us take it from them. She thought, I will write that down later, for whoever comes after. Then she stood and joined the noise, and the hall held it together, all those voices, all those species, 37 worlds worth of sound, for a long, full, unrepeatable moment. Outside, 400 light-years in every direction, the galaxy went on being vast and old and indifferent. But inside that hall, for that moment, something new had been decided. And